Virtual Humanities Happy Hour. We're delighted to have you. So let's get to the thanks right away. We want to thank the General Alumni Association who have been partnering with us for years now, in fact, decades, but especially in this time of our COVID isolation and having to do things online. They've been a real great partner in publicizing our programs. We've already done some great Think Fast forums with the GAA, and we're very thankful for their support of our programs and publicizing them, as well as looking forward to doing more with them. Our great partner in our happy hours all the time when we do them live is the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. We, of course, can't be thanking them for food, but we want you to have a bite to eat and think about the Institute of Arts and Humanities and how they help us eat during our regular happy hours. And they're continuing to promote and publicize these virtual ones. And we look forward to seeing everyone at Back Bar again soon enough. And finally, Cotton Merca Group at Morgan Stanley in Carolina Meadows, a retirement center, have been long time supporters of Carolina Public Humanities, and we're always grateful for their support. Finally, I want to thank the Carolina Asia Center. One of our panelists at our last happy hour, Donnie Santa Caterina, had put together a fantastic panel on Chinese cuisine during the time of COVID and all of the various amounts of, just to be frank, racism that is accompanied with this whole notion of Chinese food and culture around COVID. And it was an absolutely fantastic discussion. So we welcome anyone who has bounced over from that discussion to this one. And here we are going Virtual Humanities Happy Hour from Mountaintops to Monasteries, religious isolation. I'm going to invite our panelists now in order, in reverse order in which they'll be speaking. And the first person is someone who you might be familiar with. That's Joanna Cirque Smith. Let's see if we can pop up there. Hello, Joanna. Welcome.
Thank you.
Joanna, many of you might recognize Joanna as the Associate Director of State Outreach for Carolina Public Humanities, and who started working on in March and has already hosted many of these programs. But we have you now as a panelist because not only are you working in public humanities, you are, of course, finishing up your dissertation in religious studies. And we're really looking forward to hearing about your perspective, American perspectives on this whole topic. So thank you, Joanna, for joining us. How are you holding up? I talk to you pretty often, but how are you holding up? Well?
Pretty well, yeah. It's fun to be on this side of the conversation, though.
Oh, good. Well, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us. Next up, we have Afroz Taj. She's Associate Professor of the Department of Asian Studies. Afroz, hello. Welcome.
How are you?
I'm doing fine. Afroz, are you holding up well in this time of isolation? You seem like you have plenty of books behind you to keep you occupied.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm catching up.
Great. Dr. Taj is an expert on South Asian media and film, and also a writer of fiction as well. I'm interested in hearing a little bit about that. I wonder if this is a good time to be getting some writing done in fiction, but we'll talk about that later. Ben Murphy. We are not going to see Ben Murphy in moving, but we will see his picture. So Ben, are you there with us? Ben?
Yeah, I'm here. Apologies that you'll only get to see my picture, but this is the price I pay for being cheap about my internet.
Let me just say that Ben, when he's moving, I know it's hard to believe, but is even better looking than that 2D non-moving picture. So you just have to use your imagination. Ben is a PhD candidate in English and comparative literature. His expertise is on 19th century literature, especially the long 19th century. We'll be talking a little bit about some isolation movements. I think many of you might be familiar with them from that period. Also, Ben, like Joanna, was an Adams Fellow, so that's an important aspect. You're doing public humanities work now, carrying on the traditions of being an Adams Fellow in the public humanities, so thank you for that, Ben. Yeah,
thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Great. Next up is Jessica Boon, Associate Professor of Religious Studies. Dr. Boon is an expert on Renaissance and early modern monasticism, mysticism, and religious culture, especially in Spain after the Reconquista. Does that seem pretty accurate, Jess? Oh, your microphone?
That's just right, what you said.
That's right. Well, welcome back to a Carolina Public Humanities program. I know this is an odd way to be doing it, but we're delighted to have you, and we're really looking forward to hearing about what you have to share on this important topic. And finally, we have Morgan Pitelka. Morgan is a professor and chair of the Department of Asian Studies, a former director of Carolina Asia Center, and an expert on the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan and early Japanese modern culture and society. And it is a delight to have you. Morgan, how are you holding up?
Doing okay. Thank you, Max.
How are
You
you?
have to tell me the truth. Are you and Afroz actually sitting right next to each other in front of the same bookshelf, and it's all
Nope.
just artifice? No.
Nope.
Okay. Good.
There's a lot of books.
Yes. Social distancing practices in good shape. Well, Morgan, we have gone in this order because we rolled the dice or whatever we did at the beginning, and we're going to go with you first. And so, you know, the general topic, a lot of your fellow scholars are bringing a wide range of topics to bear on this notion of isolation and religious, you know, what do we get in this period of isolation? So the floor is yours. What are you going to share with us on this topic, Morgan?
So I want to talk a little bit about traditions of solitude in East Asia. I'm a historian of Japan. I'm not a scholar of religion, but I'll talk a little bit about religious streams, religious influences. And I need to start in China. China is the big, old, significant civilization in East Asia. And there are three streams of practices of solitude in China that influence the rest of East Asia, including Japan. One comes from Taoism. Taoism, very briefly, is a social and cultural tradition, some hesitate to call it a religion, in which individuals try to cultivate themselves to become more in tune with the natural world and beyond the natural world, the wider cosmos. And there's a really interesting tradition of hermetic isolation, of going to the mountains, going and living in a cave in Taoism, as a way of connecting with nature, as a way of cultivating the self. And so when we think of, in Hollywood films, the stereotype of the kind of Chinese kung fu master who you seek out on a mountaintop, that actually comes from a Taoist tradition that doesn't have anything necessarily to do with martial arts, but that is historically verifiable. One thing that I should note is it's unclear if the practice of isolation and of solitude is as important as the idea of solitude. And that's something that comes up again and again in the study of these traditions of hermits. Another tradition of solitude from China comes from Confucianism. Again, very, very basically and very broadly, Confucianism is a social and political philosophy in which ritual and rules about behavior, about comportment are followed to make society stable and smoothly functioning. And one of the really interesting ideas in Confucianism that I don't think we can qualify as a religious idea is that after a government official has served his term, he should step away from government to avoid the possibility of corruption and become a hermit, become an isolated individual who lives in solitude. Now, that's the ideal. The reality is these government officials would retire to these huge estates with lakes and pavilions and elaborate banquets, and then write poetry about how they were living as hermits. In fact, they were living on the equivalent of a golf course. But it's the idea of solitude as being an ethical choice to avoid the corruption of power. So solitude in the East Asian tradition is often associated with freedom of choice, the ability to choose autonomy, to choose to separate yourself from a political system or a cultural system that you no longer want to influence. And then the third tradition of solitude, I think, comes from Buddhism. Buddhism, as I'm sure all of our listeners know, a religion that developed in South Asia, spread all over the rest of Asia, and changed and diversified as it traveled. In China, the core lessons of Buddhism that life is suffering, suffering is caused by desire for worldly things, and that the path to extinguish suffering is through the practice of Buddhism, seems very naturally to lend itself to a tradition of solitude, right? If it's our attachments to things, to houses, to the beer that you're holding, Max, or to our relationships, right, to society, there we go, that cause us suffering, then surely living in solitude is the solution. But in fact, interestingly enough, Buddhism very broadly rejects isolated asceticism, which it sees as an extreme answer, and instead advocates for what it calls the middle path. Buddhism is actually quite a social religion. It believes in a communal approach to self-cultivation and study and the extinguishing of attachment. So monasteries and nunneries are very social places, and it's all about a collective endeavor rather than an isolated effort. So you actually find a little less solitude in the East Asian tradition coming out of Buddhism than you might think. So I'm already running long on time, so I want to share with you my screen where I have named, can you see that, Max?
Yes, indeed. It looks great.
Okay. Where I've put up the names of just 3 quick examples from Japan. Now, Japan is very influenced by China. It inherited these different streams of cultural practice, these different ideologies. And the first example that I've put here is a pretty short text called Chiteki, which you can roughly translate as Account of a Lake Arbor, that was written by a court aristocrat in 982. This is around the same time that Murasaki Shikibu, the author of The Tale of Genji, one of the great literary products of all of East Asia, was written, or she was active. And this is a very conventional Chinese, so he wrote it completely in Chinese, hermetic account, an account of living alone. But he's not really living the life of a hermit at all. He's living in a pavilion by a lake, as you can see in the title, a rather luxurious life. So this is in fact an example of the Confucian stream of solitude, where you turn away from government, you turn away from power in order to make the ethical choice to be a gentleman through self-cultivation. So that's one of the earliest examples of this kind of literature of solitude in Japan. The second, and by far the most famous text that I think really exemplifies the Japanese tradition of writing about solitude, is called Account of My Hut, or the Hojoki, written in the 13th century by Kamo Chome. This is widely available in English translation. I hope to read to you very briefly from it later, but you can find a copy online for free. You can find it through Amazon. There are recent translations that are really wonderful. And what I like about the Hojoki is that the author keeps describing the tragedies and the disasters that strike the capital city of Kyoto, where he used to live. And then he describes his reasons for living in solitude in a little hut in the mountains. And he really is living in a tiny hut. It sometimes is called a 10-foot hut because it was so small. And the kind of self-realization and pursuit of truth and knowledge that he is practicing in that life of solitude and isolation is beautifully described in the Account of My Hut. Then the third example, the Buddhist priest, painter, calligrapher, and tea master Shokado Shoujo, whose portrait you see on the screen,
Nice.
lived in Kyoto for most of his life. He lived in a Buddhist temple, but he was the most social of men. He had networks of cultural practice that were so vibrant that when he decided at the end of his life to live in a mountaintop hut outside of Kyoto, imitating, in a sense, these earlier men in this larger Chinese tradition, he couldn't do it. So he was constantly inviting all his buddies from Kyoto to come to his hut and engage in tea practice, to do joint calligraphy sessions, to talk about Buddhism. And I love the idea that even in a life of solitude, we really rely on our social connections to feel a sense of personal fulfillment. I think that's very relevant to the moment we find ourselves in
Come be
today.
alone with me, right?
That's a nice way to put it. So that's my super brief, rapid overview of a few examples of these different traditions of solitude from East Asia. And maybe if we have time later, I'll read a brief passage from the Account of My Hut.
We absolutely would welcome that. And, and
Thanks.
I'm thank you so much for that, Morgan. Very fascinating. And I know that we have just skimmed the surface of all that we could delve into this. And I do hope to revisit some of these comparisons between these cultural approaches. The first thing, we're going to be introducing our next speaker in just a moment, but the first thing that jumps out to me when I'm thinking about religion is the notion that many people are following these traditions for a sense of personal fulfillment. That's the way a lot of Western people approach this, is that, I'm into personal revelation or personal salvation, and therefore isolation might be a natural way. And I would be curious to see how much of that is in the Asian tradition or not. And I'm just going to let that sit there for a moment and bring in Jess Boon to talk a little bit about the more traditional Christian traditions regarding this, especially in the early modern period. So Jess, welcome. I hope you had a chance to listen to Morgan there.
I did.
And anything resonating with you and your and what you're going to present with us?
Absolutely. I was taking notes off camera. So I think these questions of the desire for worldly things as something that's a trap is certainly a strong element of the Christian tradition from its earliest centuries. So I work on medieval Christianity. Medieval Christianity runs from about the 5th century to the 16th century, so it's a very vast amount of time and space to cover. But this idea of worldly desires and the world as a trap is something that there were various responses to, but very often in exactly what Morgan said, that Buddhism ultimately avoids, which is asceticism. So I thought I would talk a little bit about some of the most extreme forms of asceticism that involve isolation, and some of the things that people struggled with in the midst of that, or inversely found they actually gained from it.
Thank you for that, because everybody wants to hear about the ascetic traditions, because we've heard, I think everyone has stereotypes, and I'm curious about where they line up with stereotypes and the reality, for sure.
Well, it's hard to get far past the stereotypes in just a few minutes, but we'll get a start on it. And I'm going to share my screen if
please do.
I have figured out how to do that. As something that I'm going towards. So in the earliest centuries of Christianity, this idea of salvation that Max was referring to was a choice, in a sense, in an empire where Christianity was not yet accepted. The idea of salvation was something that you could actually have some kind of control over, in the sense that if you, the idea of martyrdom, that you could continue to claim a Christian religion over against the Roman Empire would lead you into danger and possibly lead to your death. But if you died in the midst of refusing to sacrifice to other gods, then you would guarantee your salvation, which is a very powerful ideal, but then disappeared entirely once Christianity was accepted as an official religion. And what seems to have come in the wake of that is actually an embracing of asceticism and self-sacrifice in a different level. You no longer had a chance in the face of politics to do this, but instead the enemy was yourself and your desires and your wants and your needs, whether it be food, the joys of great cooking, or the joys of great company, or the joys of great romance. And those were the things that early Christians often identified as centering them on the world rather than allowing them to think about God. And so there was a tradition that grew up in the 4th and 5th centuries of what's called the Desert Fathers, or hermits, who would leave the environs that they normally lived in and move as far away from society as they could get. There's clearly a tradition of this that we don't know anything about, because they moved so far that they lost contact with society and therefore aren't part of the history.
If you disappear, it's hard to leave an impact on. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. But so what we know about are the people who got just far enough to be acclaimed for how far they had gotten, but still had some kind of connection to being able to get food, some kind of sustenance to them. And sometimes this was being out in a cave in the desert. And sometimes it was actually slightly closer to society, but up above it. So I have an image here of Simeon the Skylight, who's a famous 5th century ascetic that's being shown in a icon probably from about 600 to 800 years later, where he found a pole that was 20, 30 feet high and went and lived on it for many years. So the food had to be brought up to him or raised up to him.
Is he closer to heaven?
he's closer to heaven, he's farther from the world, but you'll notice in this icon that he's surrounded by angels, so he's not actually alone. And of course, you also have at the foot somebody who is honoring him, and so it might be somebody bringing him food or just somebody who is a follower. On the other image that I have is a famous image by Bosch in around 1500, but of the temptations of Saint Anthony. And Anthony was a famous desert father who lived off in the wilderness, but wrote about it. And we have that set of writings, and he describes the many kinds of temptations that he went through that I think many of us are experiencing in the midst of our self-isolation. Imagining all of the things that you couldn't have anymore, the food you're not eating in the restaurants, the people you're not meeting at the bars, all of those things he was wrestling with, and Bosch presents them as demons that are tearing at him. And he is asleep and imagining them, but these dreams or these demons are clearly destructive because they're horrific to look at, but yet they are all he can think of.
That's fascinating. So Jess, let me just say this notion of so being removed from the things that you were trying to get away from is causing some heartache. You're feeling exiled from the very thing that you're trying to get away from.
Right,
and
because
you're being
you took
tempted
yourself.
Yeah.
You and your tendencies are the ones that are still there. And then the process is learning to overcome them, right?
Yeah.
And what many people found was that it was impossible to overcome on your own. And so while this period of hermits in the desert was quite influential in Christianity, monasticism came out of it in part because people realized that they could do better in solitude if there was some kind of community. So monasticism is a group of people who have chosen each individually to live alone in a group where you come together to pray 7 times a day. You're not speaking your own words, you're speaking patterned words, but you're doing that in community. You're eating together in community, even if you're not talking together, and you're also all doing work around the monastery or the convent, and therefore supporting each other. So these desert fathers became an ideal, but the near impossibility of achieving a life like that led people to think about isolation in proximity.
Great.
And I know I don't have a lot of time. I just wanted to mention one more thing, which is in the later Middle Ages, after many centuries of monasticism as a principal religious ideal, there was a sort of return to what it meant to be a hermit, but a hermit in the middle of the town. And we have a record of about 1,000 people who chose to become anchorites in later medieval England. And an anchorite was somebody who sealed themselves up, went through in fact, a ceremony, and that's what you see on the left of your screen, a ceremony after petitioning the bishop to seal themselves up in a room, usually at the foot of the church, at the sort of corner of the church. And they had one window into the church so they could see the mass, and they had one window out to the public to be able to talk to people, and maybe a third window to get food through. And so they would both live in absolute isolation, but also be in the center of religious life. And Julian of Norwich, who's on the right of your screen, is famous as somebody who gave guidance, spiritual guidance to people from surrounding areas who traveled to see her, who would speak to her through this window. So she is both alone and yet in a teaching position, which I think resonates for a lot of us right now.
Really does. In a way, I feel like we're all sort of like in our anchorite boxes, and that we can look out into the world, but we're stuck in these little boxes of our own making, right?
Yeah.
I bet there are a lot of people right now who would pay to have an anchorite box outside a movie theater or something. That's at this point. So just that is absolutely fascinating. We do have to get to our other panelists, but I want to return to some of the theological ideas behind these. And I think there's a lot to be delved deeper in this. Obviously, like everything, we're doing a skim over of this idea, but certainly isolation and community seem to be necessarily combined so far in our first 2 speakers. So that's an interesting concept. Let's bring up our next speaker. And we're not going to get a moving image, unfortunately, but we will get a good-looking image of Ben Murphy. Ben, are you with us?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I can indeed. I'm gonna now. Maybe we could. Yeah, there we go. Welcome, Ben, and thank you, Ben. Have you appreciated these definitely not American perspectives on religious isolation so far?
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I have to say right off the bat that I studied the long 19th century, which I always think of as a big period, but compared to medieval Christianity and sort of the history of Asian religion, it's quite small. So I actually did take somewhat of a different approach to this, and thought I would focus on one example from the period I study.
Absolutely. Well, please do. And I understand it's not necessarily, we can think broadly about religion and spirituality with what you're going to present to us. So please have at it, Ben.
Yeah. So let's see, I think I am going to go ahead and share my screen with you so you can see an even better looking image. See if I can find this. Can you see Mr. Frederick Douglass?
I sure can.
Okay. So yeah, I think there's a lot that has already resonated with the period I study, especially listening to the other panelists talk about the ideal of isolation perhaps being more real and attainable than the practice of it. Certainly this would resonate with a lot of mid-19th century writers and thinkers, perhaps most famously Thoreau, which I'm sure a lot of people know of as doing his own sort of anchorage isolation, but in a social situation. That's actually what I thought I was going to talk about. But the more I thought about it, what really interests me in my research is this idea that something like isolation, or what we might think of as related notions of just individuality, individualism, sort of psychological interiority, all of these things are in many ways a privilege of your class position, and especially your racial position in the 19th century. So what really interests me is figures like the person you see before you. This is an image of Frederick Douglass. We now think Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century, which is always fascinating. But I've picked here an image of him from circa 1850, because I wanted to talk about one of his writings in particular that come up in that period. So Frederick Douglass is perhaps most famous for writing his autobiographies, especially his first autobiography is very well known as an example of the genre of the slave narrative, which typically tells the story of the slave who escapes from slavery and sort of makes their life in the North, typically on the abolitionist circuit. And it tells a story of sort of the classic Emersonian idea of self-reliance or sort of individualism, like raising yourself above the fetters of slavery, making something of yourself in this sort of classic American story. And Douglass is a really interesting example of this because he tells the story about himself, and it's a basically true story. I mean, his autobiography takes liberties to emphasize certain parts of his message that he wants to spread on the abolitionist circuit. But he's also someone who becomes, throughout the course of his life, increasingly frustrated with having to sort of perform his individualism or his interiority, and do it in this way, sort of on the abolitionist speaking circuit, doing it for this sort of political cause. Like, in other words, always having his story be a story about some polemical message to end slavery. So the story or the piece of writing I wanted to talk about just really briefly is actually a story he wrote, the only fiction he ever wrote. In 1853, he published this novella called The Heroic Slave. And it's an interesting story. It's a sort of fictionalized account of an actual real-life slave revolt that occurred on a ship that was taking slaves from, I believe, New Orleans, or taking them from, Virginia to New Orleans, I believe. And what so fascinated Douglass about this story was the real life slave. The historical person's name was Madison Washington. And of course, his name already sort of speaks to his significance.
I've heard of
as
those
a sort
names
of revolutionary.
before.
Yeah, you know this? Yeah. Yeah, they're familiar names. And it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between this actual person and Douglass really sort of identified with him. But what so troubled Douglass is that there wasn't actually that much known about this person. Douglass actually organized to go interview this person, and it never occurred just because of sort of various things, but he wanted to take a trip down to the Bahamas, where he was living as a free man after his escape. It didn't happen. So Douglass always had this sort of admiration for this heroic slave who led a revolt on this ship, but didn't know enough about him. And so what he did as a sort of solution to this problem of wanting to memorialize this person was to write a novel, basically a novella, where he sort of invents plausible, if not completely believable, circumstances for what led up to this event. So all of this is to get around to the topic that we're here to talk about, the sort of solitude and isolation. What interests me about this story vis-a-vis this topic is actually in the very first couple pages, the way that we are, as readers, are introduced to Madison Washington, this heroic slave, is to first see this character, I've put his name here, Mr. Listwell, whose name gives us a sort of clue right off the bat. He is the stand-in for the audience. He is the sort of stand-in for the abolitionist audience. He's this white man who is in the woods. I think his horse is like drinking from a creek or something, and he overhears this eloquent sort of monologue occurring in the glen of this foresty sort of shadowed place. And he listens to this figure speaking. He can't quite see him at first, and this person is sort of speaking, and he hears this voice talk himself into freedom, basically, to say, they tell me I'm a slave, but I'm actually a man, and to sort of claim this mantle of freedom. And all this is happening while he's listening, and he finally gets a glimpse of this person, and he realizes that it's this slave who is sort of hidden away in the woods and is having this revelation. And he describes him this way as a sable preacher to his solitary temple. And then this is the line I wanted to accentuate. Being a literary scholar, I thought it was kind of my duty to actually throw up some text. So here we are. So he says, he is pouring out his hopes and resolutions to the lonely woods. To him, those distant church bells have no grateful music. He shuns the church, the altar, and the great congregation of Christian worshipers, and wanders away to gloomy forests to utter in the vacant air complaints and griefs which the religion of his times and his country can neither console nor relieve.
Wow.
So there's a lot. I mean, I think this is a really fascinating story, but I think what's doubly interesting to me here is we have Douglass using this story to sort of needle the hypocrisy of Christianity in the 19th century, which he did often in his speeches and his writings. But what I think is perhaps even more interesting is just this idea of a slave, a sort of heroic Revolutionary era hero slave who Douglass identifies with, who is making his bid for freedom, and all the while doing so while this person listens on, who is supposed to be a figure for us, the audience. And this idea that Douglass wants to emphasize the sort of heroic individuality of this person that can only be expressed in this moment of solitude in this like foresty glen. But at the same time, there's always this kind of tension because we, the audience, this white person, are sort of listening there. And so there's this tension between Douglass wanting to say that this black slave has this heroic individuality, but having it always be sort of, it has to be witnessed and like sort of vouchsafed by a white person of standing or something like this.
You know, it's remarkable, Ben. I thank you for that, because I do think if a theme is emerging, I love these happy hours because we're never really quite sure of the theme that emerges, but this whole notion of community and isolation and the balance between them. And in this case, we have the expectations of a community and the solace of isolation that this person has, and or needing to be heard. I mean, it's all very interesting. Are you seeing these connections too?
Yeah, certainly. I think, I mean, it's sort of a roundabout way of getting to this, I suppose. But I mean, I think one of the things that, in terms of the question of divinity and religion, that just interests me is that in the context of the story, the character of Madison Washington is just kind of speaking to himself. It's a soliloquy or monologue, but this listener automatically thinks of it as a prayer or an appeal to religion or something, which I think in a way is a sort of, I think that's almost problematic in a way. Like he wants to be able to sort of just have this connection to himself. He's talking to himself, but we can't hear the slave do that without making it about religiosity or spirituality or something. So I think Douglass is kind of building in these tensions, like, but yeah, I definitely see some connections already.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you for that. And it is true, absolutely. I think many people would think Thoreau is the interesting way to go. But one of the big, perhaps criticisms of Thoreau is just how embedded he was in Brahmin society of Boston, and not necessarily. I don't want to throw Thoreau under the bus, but certainly not having the same need or solace that isolation is going to bring, or the ability that for this character in this text, that isolation is allowing them to articulate. So thank you for bringing this. Definitely a perspective that we need to see.
Yeah, I should say, though, just as my due, that I am also drinking my prop beer here, and it's out of a glass with Thoreau's face on it. So.
Oh, well, there we go. So maybe we can hear the sips, and we'll hear we'll hear Henry David complaining about my throwing him under the bus there for a moment. So, all right. Well, thank you for that, Ben. We're going to bring you back in for more conversation with our other scholars, but I do want to bring in Afroz Taj. Where are you, Afroz? Hello, and your microphone. Welcome. And we have been told that it's not the same bookshelf that Morgan's in front of. The
only difference is that we are next to each other. The difference is the language. Like, he is sitting in front of Japanese books, and I'm sitting right front of Hindi Urdu books.
There might be one or two in common. I'm just guessing.
Yeah. No, but well, there is overlap.
Yeah, of course, indeed. So I have certainly we've had a lot of different perspectives on this topic, from religion as well as just from personal solace that isolation is bringing them, this notion of community. What are your thoughts on this broad topic?
Okay, thank you very much. First, I just wanted to thank you that what a wonderful topic these days you chose. Is so overwhelming and so much to talk about. But the concept of solitude in India is so hard to talk about. As you know, India is a romantic country, and you can tell by the population. So the concept of solitude is basically alien to South Asia. In both Hinduism and Islam, there is a concept of private meditation or prayers, which is supposed to be done alone, away from the rest of the people. And on that point, I just have to mention one of my friends, Swami Yogi Raj Om Prakash Ji Maharaj. He runs the ashram. He spends 1 month every year alone in an underground chamber. He doesn't speak, see, or interact with anybody. He doesn't, is not connected just for a whole month. He says this practice is not just to be alone, but it is for self-discipline and self-purification. Otherwise, he's very involved in his community, runs a school, Ayurvedic hospital. He also tours the whole world, including Chapel Hill. He comes here also. That's how I met him first time.
Wow.
So this is like in last 22 years, like back to back, we have been doing study abroad. But this is in 22 years, it's the first time we are spending time in Chapel Hill. So in our 22 years, we saw so many sadhus, so many mahatmas, so many people are away from the rest of the world. So I remember one person in our study abroad, we used to take students to Himalayas, the source of Ganges. So we used to go there, and every year I used to meet one specific person used to live in his shanty. His name, he was a sadhu. Sadhu means like the godly man or monk. So he was living in his shanty. So his name was Lal Baba. Baba means respected or elderly person. So Lal Baba, I used to talk to him all the time. So why do you live away from the rest of the world? He became slowly became very open to me and sharing the thoughts. And he was, in fact, writing non-stop stuff. So he was saying, let me tell you, so many epidemics in this world, so many diseases in this world. I just wanted to spend my time in a fresh air, peaceful environment. My mind is peaceful now. And I help tourists also, and easier to concentrate on God. So I thought that, wait a minute, the same concept is in Islam also, like we are talking about like a Hindu monk.
Mm-hmm.
In Islam, the same concept and practice exists called Ishtama or Wazifa. They also close themselves away from the rest of the world. In fact, as you know, this month, like
Sure.
this is the holy month, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And-
So by chance, this month is famous that Prophet Muhammad was in cave, isolated from the rest of the world, lived in cave Hira, Hira. And then the Quran revealed on him. This is the month. Like he got chapter by chapter. That's why they say that this is that's why they call it holy month, Ramadan. So, and it's the Middle East is close to South Asia, as you know. In South Asia, so crowded, so hard to concentrate. This is the only form of privacy available, that you go into solitude to meditate themselves. In study abroad in India, in homestay, our students find out that it's considered rude to say, I want to be alone in India.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was overwhelming for me. I mean, for me was, when I saw India through their point of view, then I was very surprised also as well. There is a similar concept, which is renunciation or sannyas. This is considered the last phase of life for Hindus. And let me show you some pictures in the.
Yes, please.
I'm talking about, what am I talking about when we're talking about sadhus? Let me figure out.
Okay. It's a very good point. You know, Ramadan in and of itself is a sort of form of ritualized isolation, right, for this month, in terms of eating or asceticism.
By chance, yeah.
Yeah. So are you have, there we go, images coming up.
Yeah, they are coming. So let me see. Every time becomes different screen, by the way.
Yes. Did you want to maximize the
Yeah, I'm trying to maximize.
Okay.
And he's my friend, Yogirajji Maharaj Om Prakash Ji. I take my students also, and Swami Yogiraj Om Prakash Ji Maharaj. Yeah. So sannyas is the renunciation of the pleasure of life as well as human relationships. Sannyasis become sadhus often. These are wandering holy men who live of charity. So these are the sadhus.
Mm-hmm.
One is just chilling. The other one is thinking and looking at Ganges right now.
Wow.
Yeah. So unlike stereotype, they rarely live in caves, but rather live in communities or urban ashrams.
So there are different levels at which you're separating yourselves from society. At the same time that you separate yourself from society, you kind of are creating this other society that you're living in. It seems like they're the sadhus are in the same place there and together.
Exactly, Max.
Yeah.
But this is so interesting. Like you reminding me one thing. This is so interesting. There are people are living separately, isolated from the rest of the world. They never come down from Himalayas. And there are people living with the families, adopted the families, and these monks are living just like a part of the family, but they are monks. And there are third kind of monk, which you reminded me, like you can see the picture right now. These monks are this is Haridwar, like the foothill of Himalayas, where I take students. You can see one of my students standing and smiling. I don't know how much is she smiling. So yeah, so this one, like these people are living in Himalayas and coming down every day in the morning to get food and going back again. So there are third kind of people, like using and changing the situations. So Indian Sufi orders have adopted the same yogic practices like chanting, seclusions, etc. So Muslim sadhus are called malang or fakir. So hard to tell sometimes who is Muslim sadhu, who is Hindu sadhu, and because they're more or less same. And sometimes the color code is, you can see, it's so hard to. Most of them have beard, and most of them like long hair, like me.
And similar practices in terms of some of the practices you were saying in terms of this going up into the mountains and coming down, or also having these. I mean, I imagine the Sufis are not as interested in the holy Ganges, perhaps, but similar other types of practices.
Exactly, but who knows? We see, this is so interesting. So Sufism is doesn't have the solid boundary. Sufism is very blurry between religions, right? That's why they have a solid path towards God. But humanities, when the question comes about the humanities, they cannot point out their solid boundary at all. So maybe Sufis are there. I don't know, but I have not seen.
Well, thank you for that, Afroz. We do have to kind of move on to get all of our panelists in, but if there is another picture we can look at quickly that you want to show us,
okay, all right. But just last point, I just wanted to make that real quick. Most fakirs and Sufis, however, they live with the communities. In general, the sadhus and fakir who choose to live away from the world do so because they want to escape from not just crowd, pollution, and disease, but also judgments of society about class, rules, and gender.
Wow. I mean, these are all reasons for self-protection, for sure.
And escape.
Yeah, escape. Very interesting. And so there's embedded in these social contexts, disease and, crowded conditions, perhaps not access to food, whatever it is. These are social conditions that are necessitating this practice that has, it seems like, real world reasons for it as well as spiritual reasons for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me a chance to share these thoughts.
Thank you for that. And we'll bring everyone back in for some final thoughts in a bit. But let's bring up our final speaker, Joanna Cirque-Smith. Joanna, I want to first thank you. We all need to give, if you want to, we can give your one of those hands to Joanna for putting this whole panel together. And Joanna, I feel at times you should be the one monitoring this because you know more of what to expect. But here we are. You are now a guest, a panelist, and you're going to give us some of your insights on American perspectives on religious isolation. So
yes,
please.
I will. And I will keep it brief, but I do want to say a huge thank you to the other panelists because there are so many generative connections here. So my research has focused a lot on new religious movements in American history. And during this crisis, I've been thinking specifically about utopian communal movements that have withdrawn from society as a group, often to shield themselves from what they see as the corrupting influence of the outside world. And there are so many examples of this, it was very hard to choose one. From the 1700s, we have the Shakers. In the 1800s, there were all sorts of utopian experiments like Oneida. And then there are many 20th century examples, I think most infamously People's Temple and the Branch Davidians. And many of these groups have withdrawn from society specifically because they believe that their community's structure and rules reflect some kind of divine blueprint, that they are attuned to the natural order of things in a way that outsiders not only cannot understand, but in a way that the outside world threatens to corrupt. But the kind of committed communal isolation that many of these groups have demanded of their followers is a really hard sell. To join many of these groups, you would have to break off contact with family members. You would have to quit your job. You might have to become celibate if you're joining a group like the Shakers. So the example that I want to briefly focus on with you today is actually an example where this vision of utopian communal retreat was actually very successfully commercialized and sold to a non-religious audience. So I'm talking specifically about the Seventh-day Adventists and the Battle Creek Sanatorium.
Ah.
So the Seventh-day Adventists, very, very briefly, are a religious group that was founded in the mid-1800s and who believed that Jesus had returned already and spiritually ushered in a new cosmic era. And along with that comes, of course, a new set of religious rules. So they were just across the board very into abstinence. Abstinence from meat, from caffeine, from alcohol, from sex. And in their logic, by following these rules of abstinence, people would begin to transform not only their bodies, but their souls. They would become naturally clearer-headed and less lustful, and they would be more energetic workers and more compassionate neighbors. So by a physical transformation, the soul itself would be transformed. But very interestingly, rather than creating isolated communes, which many groups with similar practices to theirs did, the Seventh-day Adventists opted to open a sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan in 1866. And John Harvey Kellogg of Cornflakes fame was heading it up for them. And it eventually grew to hold over 1,000 guests at a time. And it became this huge center where celebrities of the day would come and stay for a few weeks or a month.
Was Kellogg himself a Seventh-day Adventist?
He was actually an adopted son of the founder.
No.
So he was deep in it. And arguably, although this was billed as a kind of secular therapeutic retreat, it functioned very similarly to a utopian commune, with the twist being that it was simply peopled by paying guests instead of by permanent residents. Mm-hmm. So everyone who came there followed the same rules. They ate very bland food. They exercised in the freezing cold. They took cold water baths. They were very into enemas as a medical treatment. And they would come together every evening to listen to lectures on health, hygiene, and morality. So even though folks who came to stay at the sanitarium were, of course, encouraged to follow these tenets in the outside world, it was really understood that they could only practice them fully when they were in this isolated community, and that they would need to periodically retreat from their city lives and come to the sanitarium to hit the reset button on this. So I'm going to show you just one quick picture that will give you a little look at what life was like there. So this is an example of an outdoor exercise class. So you can tell these men are not alone, but they are also not behaving as they probably would if they were going about their normal urban lives.
And some of that outfit is not too far off from the sadhus that we were just looking at, a couple of those.
It's true, although I suspect it might be colder weather.
Yes, I think so.
All right. Sorry, let me see here. So in this model, what's interesting to me is that isolation from broader society is less about actively cultivating some inner truth, so much as it is removing obstacles to it, stripping away, in this case, the literal physical toxins that Seventh-day Adventists believed would obscure our vision about the real reality of things. So this example, for me, really complicates the line between secular and religious ideas of retreat. And it shows an interesting example of a religious group very actively trying to navigate just what degree of isolation people can handle.
Wow, thank you for that. Very interesting. And I think that we have some time open for questions. Joanna, what I think is really interesting about what you're saying, and I've, again, tying this to the sort of overriding theme of community, is that we can't help but think about our own situation right now. And in every one of these things, we're talking about sort of intentional isolation, intentional communities. And I think it's interesting for all of us to think about this case of sort of not intentional and universal isolation. It's not like everybody's getting it at the same time. So, you know, what lessons are there? These are very intentional groups that are pulling themselves away from society. We're all falling into it together. And I'm just curious what we can learn from those that do it intentionally with us who are sort of stuck here, if you will.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Folks, we will have a few questions. I want to invite all of our panelists to turn their microphones back on. I mean, they're video cameras and microphones back on if they would. And we have some questions from the audience that I would like to address. And I think anybody can jump in on any of these. But before we begin, let me ask if there's anything that any of the panelists would like to comment on what they've heard the other panelists saying, if there are any cross currents that you would like to respond to. And this is the beauty of Zoom, is that we sit here and there we are. Hello,
Hey,
Morgan.
I had to move upstairs to start cooking dinner. Those are the times we live in. But anyway, I just wanted to say that I didn't really emphasize this in my presentation, but in the East Asian context, the kind of solitude we're talking about is not necessarily seen as being religious or spiritual. There can be that dimension, and I think the bigger question is, what is the demarcation line between the secular and the sacred in different places in the world at different historical moments? And that's not the topic for today. But you know, the decision of a Confucian scholar to retreat from government and go and live on an estate by a lake to avoid corruption is not really religious, although it accords with a kind of philosophy, with a vision of the social and political organization of the universe that veers a little towards religion. Or a Buddhist who chooses to live in a small hut to avoid the temptations of the material world in the city, that's getting closer to our conception of religion. That's more like the ascetic practices that Afroz was talking about. Or I loved the example that Jess gave of living in a tiny house next to a church, basically. So I think this question of what and actually we had a question in the Q&A as well about what is the motivation.
Yeah, sure. Let's get to that question.
Well, some of us answered it already. Diana Newton asked, do the speakers see solitude as a spiritual practice, a psychological need, or a social preference? And I would guess from what I've heard that the answers really vary, that there's a remarkable diversity of reasons for embracing solitude.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for addressing that question. Would anyone like to take on Diana's question about sort of parsing out these aspects of isolation, whether it's psychological, spiritual? Anyone else want to take that on? Social preference, spiritual practice, or psychological need?
I mean, I would say everybody has their own motivation. It's based on individual. Is that right? In that, yeah.
I would think, yeah, but there are, of course, cultural and social practices that it seems like in certain times and places this is more normative for us, right? These types of practices, and yet all of these seem to be exceptions, right? That there are these exceptional people who do this, but the times themselves say this is a normative reaction for you to be to go off and do this. You know, Confucian, go off and live a life away from temptation or whatnot. So yeah, go ahead, Jess.
And I think, at least in medieval Christianity, the ascetics were very aware that some people are better made for this. And that's part of what I answered to the question by typing, is that for some people, they don't have a lot of demons that they have to fight. And so asceticism, it fits with certain natural rhythms of their lives. And others are fighting it every day of their life. And so there's a sense of, some are attracted to it because it makes sense for them, and some are stuck in the feeling that this is the only way towards salvation. And I think a lot more of us feel the latter right now. Because but it's a different kind of salvation. It's towards health, right? But I think it's that sense of it's a struggle every single day.
You know, an interesting aspect about this, we're all sort of stuck in the situation, and yet many people have, and this is not a religious comment, sort of to Morgan's point, some practices are not religious at all, but you hear this notion of self-help, like now is the time that I'm going to work on either stopping drinking, so much for that in the happy hour, but, you know, I'm going to stop drawing, I'm going to work on this self-help and all of these ideas. So there is this notion that, you know, here's an opportunity for isolation and to become a better person before we open up and go back into community. I think that is an interesting tie-in for sure. Jess, I'm going to direct this question to you. It's from our dear friend Paul Connick, and I'm directing it to you because your work is more in sort of the Western traditions of religion and more ancient. This is the question: is there any carryover from the monasticism of the Jewish first-century sects, like the Essenes, to Christianity? Was it seen as a tradition that traces back to Judaism?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. Most of the work that I've seen in relation to the potential influence of Essenes, or at least an ideal that the Essenes held that was circulating in first, second century, so therefore influential on Christians, is an ideal of virginity. And that's something I don't think we've talked about in terms of asceticism today, focusing a little bit more on isolation and difficulty of attaining food, for example. But certainly that one of the most difficult worldly temptations to fight is carnal desire, as they say in fancy ways. By the time, and the Essenes also withdrew in order to do that. I think by the time monasticism was a sort of 5th century response to the inability to achieve martyrdom anymore, the Essenes would not have been directly influential. But I think this idea that any kind of temptation comes from community,
Yeah.
I think is available from the earliest century of Christianity.
Thank you for that observation. I just like to say that one of our attendees has put up a good point, tying things together somewhat, and that is, I believe it's Kellyanne Scoot. I want to say it's Scootvik has said that Adventists were also non-meaters and produced some of the first soy products in America. So that there's any connection between the Asian religions and the Adventists. Maybe it's soy. I don't know. And anyway, interesting observation. We are coming up towards the end of our hour. I want to invite anyone who still has any questions to put them on our, yes, here's another one from Paul Connick. We'll probably end with this question. Is there a distinction to be made between asceticism and self-mortification? I think that the latter is unduly cruel and punitive, while the former may be merely a way of seeking simplicity and an uncluttering of one's world. I guess, Jess, you might comment on that as well.
Although I think Joanna's discussion of Kellogg might also.
Yeah, and
No.
yes.
So perhaps
Yeah,
Joanna,
self-mortification for sure.
First?
Please. Yeah, good point.
I mean, I feel like in the context of Kellogg, it does often seem like punishing the senses is a way of retraining them to have holy desires. I don't know if that lines up with what you've found in your work as well, but.
Yeah, and I think just any kind of movement away, if it's a movement away physically from the world to the top of the mountain or the middle of the desert, or just a turning of the senses from the exterior towards the interior, which a variety of Christian mystics discuss, it's a retraining. And sometimes retraining requires physical mortification in order to actually upend everything that the body itself is expecting. But I like the way that Paul Connick has put it. It's very eloquent, and those are some distinctions between asceticism as in restriction or getting better habits versus asceticism as bodily mortification.
Great, thank you.
And I loved the image that you had, Joanna, of the people doing their training, because they're all 6 feet apart.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, they were social distancing.
Good social distancing practices.
Maybe I can just mention as well that, Japan is often associated with pretty severe practices of self-harm. If you think of the image of the samurai engaging in seppuku or harakiri, the ritualistic suicide that is seen as an honor in a very narrow tradition of Bushido, or the way of the warrior. I just wanted to say that although that tradition is there, it is 100% divorced from the traditions we've been talking about of reclusion, of solitude, of being a hermit. And there is, to my knowledge, no, religious tradition of self-harm of the sort that we find in some of these other cultures in the Japanese context, which is just something interesting to note.
And also Morgan and Jess and Joanna, that observing the fast. This is, I would consider it self-hurting, and also like beating their chest in some sects of Islam. They do this also.
Well, thank you for that. Ben, I'd like to bring you back in, Ben, because you brought, I think if there's an interesting perspective on this is to look at the point you're trying to make, that Frederick Douglass is trying to make about isolation and the sort of glorification of it. And I'm hoping I'm reading that correctly, and that what we're talking about is this person is out in the woods bemoaning their situation, and someone's reading that as some sort of elevated religious sentiment. Am I reading that correctly, Ben? And then I'll ask you my question here.
Yeah, I think it goes to that first audience question that we took. I guess I didn't actually say this, but I think one way I'm thinking about religion is a sort of political, civic religion. Like, what does it mean to be a sort of good American in the 19th century? And I think what that text does for me is shows Douglass's understanding of what even an abolitionist culture wants a slave to be, but also his frustration with being an individual who's having that sort of foisted on you, as opposed to sort of doing it your own way. Like, as you said, a sort of normative structure or expectation of what that looks like.
Well, thank you for that. It's I want to thank all of you. I think our perspectives on this have been really interesting, and especially because we're all stuck in this situation where, it's not, is it isolation? Here we are talking, across the airwaves, across in ways we've had guests on and panelists, sometimes coming from overseas and joining us. So in a way, we're far more connected than we've ever been. And here we are at the same time feeling isolated. And I think we're at, what I would like to suggest is that this moment that we're in is allowing us to really think about what connection means, right? Because there's no difference between the world we're living in right now in terms of the electric connectivity we have. We were looking at screens before, but somehow we're finding that this moment of isolation is forcing us to think about human connection in different ways. And I find that to be an interesting element. And what I'm learning tonight is that there are reasons to go into isolation. And yet they always seem to be tied somehow to the community, right? There's this, to use an Asian idea, the yin and yang of this. You can't have isolation without having the community from which you're isolating. So thank you all for joining us. And I want to thank Joanna for putting this program together in particular. I want to thank all of our panelists, Joanna Cirque Smith, Jess Boon, Afroz Taj, Morgan Pitelka, and Ben Murphy. I also want to thank Paul Bonici for putting this all together. Morgan, that food looks good. We all wish we could have a bite, but the beer tastes good too, at any rate. So I also want to thank Paul Bonici for all the work he's done putting these programs together. And we do hope that you join us. We have a special program next week. We do have a Talking Humanities coming up on Tuesday, which should be great. Go to humanities.unc.edu. Those are small group talks. And this will be on the wonderful article that we looked at last week, What do the Humanities Offer in a Time of Pandemic? But more important, folks, we are not going to be doing a happy hour next week. We're doing a special program called History Repeats, the Ahmaud Arbery and racism in the 21st century. And so, unfortunately, folks, a lot of the painful things that existed before the time of the pandemics persist during this time. And we're going to dedicate our time next Thursday to a really important discussion about racism in America and where we stand now. And hopefully that will enlighten us, but we do not call that a happy hour for obvious reasons. So please join us for that. We have another biography series coming up, and that'll be coming up in early June, which we're hoping to launch online. We do hope to see all of you live for real and a real event soon enough. And in the meantime, folks, I'm going to ask Paul Bonici if he could put up the link If you are willing to help us, folks, Carolina Public Humanities, as we weather this period in which we bring in zero revenue for our public programs, we are we welcome any donations you have for us. And of course, all donations are tax deductible. We wish we didn't have to ask, but of course, I think a lot of people will be, in fact, needing a lot of support in a lot of industries. So thank you all. One more time for our panelists, Joanna, Afroz, Jess, Morgan, and Ben. I thank you all. It's been wonderful seeing you, and we'll see you next time at Happy Hour 2 weeks from now and at a Public Humanities event in between. Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.